So when all is said and done, how was Donald Trump as a president of the United States? Doing an assessment of his impact is tricky. There's all sorts of hyperbole flying around about what his term did or didn't involve. A lot of it formulated by partisan activists, so it tends to be based on a heavily filtered view of reality. On the assumption that we're still allowed to have this conversation, which I think we still are, here's my list of Trump's positive achievements in office, also my list of the significant negatives over the noise of all the things he was accused of that didn't have a lot of evidence. And then to finish off with a few general lessons that come from aspects of Donald Trump's presidency that weren't necessarily pros or cons. Let's start off with the positives. These divide into two types. There are the positives that just about everyone recognises, and there are those that people would consider to be more contentious. Starting with the first group. First, the president was the first to recognise the path that China was taking and to adopt a much more confrontational stance, particularly his campaign to build 5G networks on Western rather than Chinese technology. It was extremely disruptive to the momentum that many countries were at that point following. But once the Chinese responses started to be seen, people began to realise just how integrated they were becoming in terms of their strategic infrastructure. Frankly, how vulnerable they'd made themselves. It started to change. Australia banned Huawei from its 5G networks in 2018. Canada and Singapore said they'd use non-Chinese tech last year. The UK, after being initially resistant, followed soon after, even ordering that Huawei components should be removed from existing infrastructure. France, Germany, others followed. Even David Frum, a massive and persistent critic of Trump, gave him this one. He said this: 5G is a rare case in which Trump's abrasive methods yielded results that might not have been achieved by a more emollient administration. Score one for him, and it's an important one. It wasn't just 5G, of course. He was pretty strong in support of the people of Hong Kong, warning China not to use violence to suppress pro-democracy activists. His interventions got the Hong Kong activists marching with American flags and singing the US national anthem, so they seemed to like what he had to say. And it seems highly likely that although the Biden administration won't be firing off China-shaming tweets at 2 a.m, it will nevertheless be maintaining a critical and assertive attitude to China, recognising that this is the right move for the moment. Okay, number 2, the destruction of the ISIS caliphate in Syria and Iraq. Trump had a marked preference for bringing American troops home and out of harm's way, but he continued the anti-ISIS campaign in 2017-2018, concluding with the US raid that killed the ISIS commander Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi on October 2019. The group still has a presence in the countries, but no longer has territory under its control. Number 3, prison reform. He signed the First Step Act, which was a criminal justice reform bill that made the justice system fairer, helped former inmates to return to society. Now, it doesn't quite fit the distorted vision of Trump as a fire-breathing, punitive law and order guy, but it's often the people that have nothing to prove to their supporters who can take the steps that others would find it hard to win. You won't have heard much about the fact that, according to the Gadsden Times, more than 90% of those benefiting from the sentencing reductions in the First Step Act were African Americans. Number 4, the Space Force. You won't see Biden dismantling this, in spite of the scorn that some people poured onto it when it was first announced. On the one hand, it's tasked with defending the US military's assets, and one assumes America's assets generally in space. It certainly occurred to America's enemies that should actual conflict break out again in the future, an offensive capability to take out key satellites conveys a big strategic advantage. On the other hand, it also gave added energy and impetus to NASA, pushing a target to return with manned missions to the moon as a first step to setting sights on Mars. So those were the consensus ones, where what he did in office is unlikely to be reversed by the Biden administration because basically they're seen as fairly solid achievements. They won't give him credit for any of them, but that's a standard for politics. They take the gains and move on. Some of the others. Trump fulfilled a 2016 campaign promise by renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement and creating a US-Mexico-Canada agreement. The deal came with the caveat that Mexico would overhaul its labour laws. That involved improving conditions for Mexican workers and also de-incentivising moving jobs beyond the southern border where companies could exploit poor conditions out of the US. Even Nancy Pelosi agreed that the deal was much better than NAFTA, although of course she suggested that it was because of her party's input that made it better. Not everyone conceded the deal as a win. David Frum said, Trump's much ballyhooed US-Mexico-Canada trade agreements simply inserted more automobile protectionism into the old NAFTA without addressing the big North American trade issues of the 21st century, especially the needs of the digital economy and cross-border shipping. One of Trump's biggest achievements was his impact on the Middle East. And it was one of those areas where movement happened, arguably because of his willingness to defy conventional wisdom. He moved the US Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem and proposed a peace plan that focused on economic development rather than immediate Palestinian statehood. All the experts predicted that his policies would ignite regional conflict, but actually the opposite happened. And the breakthroughs became evident, with the United Arab Emirates, then Bahrain and Sudan, then Morocco, opening diplomatic relations with Israel. While the experts all believed nothing could be done unless the Palestinian question was resolved first, Jared Kushner picked up on the frustration that many of the states were feeling with what they saw as Palestinian intransigence. The leadership there had been overplaying its hand as the side that must be dealt with before any progress could be made. Those experts also believed that America had to be even-handed between Israel and the Arab states to be able to act as a broker. Again, Trump ignored that logic, being unambiguously on the side of Israel. And his slightly erratic approach may well have been the deciding factor, with abrupt policy changes, such as supporting and then not supporting the Kurds, appeasing and then sanctioning Turkey, withdrawing US forces and then recommitting them. It's possible that the sense that literally anything could happen pushed the Israelis and the Gulf states into stabilising their relations almost as a defensive measure. Whatever the reason, it worked. Groups on the left that had been basically pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel hated the deals because they simply felt that progress had been made by throwing the Palestinians under the bus. And if you're partisan in that way, then the finer nuances of the politics between the Palestinians and the Gulf states won't necessarily have been a factor you'd have been paying much attention to. But again, even Trump critic David Frum conceded grudgingly, whatever the cause, he leaves office with this particular conflict closer to resolution than when he entered office. The most contentious part of that was pulling from the Iran nuclear deal. It was condemned by all and sundry when he did it, but there's not much doubt that it wasn't exactly a highly effective deal, and Iran was happily moving its way where it wanted to go in spite of it. Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran put the regime under significant stress, forced it to cut funding for terrorist proxies such as Hezbollah, and led to a real reaction against the regime within Iran, previously unseen since the 1979 revolution. There's a good case to be made that this is a more effective way of dealing with a major sponsor of terrorism than a policy of appeasement. Now Biden is signalling that a new agreement with Iran is one of his key goals. Whether he'll see himself as having a stronger hand to play in negotiating a new deal, or whether he'll go with Iran's current demands that the US simply return to the original agreement, at the point of shooting this video, it's not known. In other areas, Trump also restored due process on campuses. In 2011, the Obama administration brought in guidance on sexual harassment that universities often interpreted as an instruction to believe all women in the sense of not bothering with basic principles of justice when it came to sexual assault allegations. Instead, they adopted low standards of proof, no cross-examination of the alleged victim if they don't want it, double jeopardy rules violated. Students started bringing lawsuits against the universities for denying their rights, up to 100 cases per year. Trump rescinded Obama's guidance and restored principles of due process. He also attacked the use of critical race theory in employee training by federal agencies, which I think stands as the common sense stand, but one that was quickly reversed by Biden coming in. Although he didn't have much of a sense of the historical importance of NATO and the value of the alliance providing some important global stability, nevertheless he did get the NATO allies to increase their own defence spending rather than simply riding on the US coattails. American presidents have been moaning and whining about the lack of spending by European allies for decades. But the absolute conviction that America was totally committed to NATO never gave them much of an incentive to do anything about it. With Trump, they realised what seemed to be a very good chance he might just walk away. As a result, allies increased defence spending by $130 billion since 2016, and they were forced to take more responsibility for their own approach to security generally in the world, which is no bad thing in itself. And one last thing to mention on the positive side. Bearing in mind that Trump is always held by his critics to only ever be out for himself and to always be looking for opportunities to enrich himself, it's worth noting that he promised on the campaign trail that he would donate his presidential salary rather than keeping it, and every year that is exactly what he's done. He's gifted it to various recipient government departments and also sent $100,000 to the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism in memory of his oldest brother Fred. Now, does that mean he's a selfless giver and a warm human being? No. All the narcissistic traits and the obnoxious practices of his businesses and lots of other things besides put the lie to that version. But the story isn't as one-sided as some would have you believe. All right, what about the negatives? You have to sort these from a lot of the nonsense that is spread about Trump popularly. Generally, any major charges that arose from something he said, those things are not important. Trump used language clumsily, and a hostile press leapt onto the things he said, interpreted them in the worst possible way to create a mythology that he certainly not intended. Now, his supporters will focus on pointing out that he never said that, for instance, there were fine people on both sides, meaning white supremacists on one of the sides. He'd said several times he didn't mean those people, but the press just ignored that and fed outrage with a partial quote. Likewise, he talked about UV, not bleach, when he talked about disinfectant for the virus. But the real point, as a downside for the president, was precisely that he was incapable of using language in the way that a president should. When he was on script, he made some good speeches, but he was almost never on script. And he just wandered around speculating about various things, calling people names, making boasts, and generally behaving like a party bore. His supporters discounted this and said, just the nature of the beast, you had to take him seriously, but not literally, which is the sort of strategy, sort of coping strategy you follow when you have to. But it wasn't an asset of the president that you had to do that. Yes, the press almost behaved just as bizarrely in their own way. Like the fact that every single interview they'd ask him if he disavowed white supremacy, even though towards the end of that he'd already done it numerous times. That said, there were certain messages that Trump put out that put the system of the United States at risk. And he did so deliberately, arguably not understanding the forces he was playing with, but it didn't reduce the harm. And that really focuses on his arguments that if he lost an election, it could only be because of fraud. He started laying the groundwork in 2016 when everyone expected him to lose, and he was preparing the ground for that outcome. I absolutely believe it was simply because he hates the idea of losing, so he wanted an excuse that meant he could say that if it had been fair, he'd have won and that sort of thing. But electoral systems are fragile. The US Constitution was tested and survived in civil war. Doesn't make provoking another one a good idea? Persuading a significant percentage of the people that they have been cheated is an incendiary behaviour. For a president to do such things, possibly the most irresponsible thing they could do. And, he could have said, well, I'm convinced that I won this election, but for the good of the country, I will concede. And that's pretty much what Al Gore did, with a much closer election and much more cause, arguably, for grievance in 2000. Whatever you think about Al Gore's ability to accurately communicate climate science or his responsibility in making that issue a partisan one, and I've criticised both of those things in the past, he took the action in that election that kept the country together when it most counted. Trump, unfortunately, chose to double down and feed every conspiracy theory and surround himself with advisors who would support the delusion. Again, I don't think he did that understanding the consequences, but it's certainly the case he was reckless to the consequences, and if you're going to be a good president, you need to understand the consequences. It destroyed his ability to continue to be a player in the politics of the country going forward, and it was wholly self-inflicted. The impact on the country was so serious that arguably, on its own, it outweighs all of the positives put together, and that's a tragedy for his legacy. The other significant negative came from his handling of the pandemic. Again, you have to separate this out from the nonsense. I thought one of the most disgraceful statements of the 2020 election was Joe Biden suggesting that if it hadn't been for Trump, 400,000 people in the US would have been alive today who instead were killed by COVID. The truth is that the same factors that have led the UK to be heavily hit probably meant the US was always going to be hard hit, whoever was in charge. The belief people have that good government should be able to counter a virus massively weighted in a false belief in human agency. Certain countries that were geographically distant and therefore could effectively shut down their borders without massive consequence, New Zealand and Australia, they were in a position to go early and heavy, and they could be successful in clearing the virus long enough for the vaccine to arrive. The US was never in a position to do that, and its culture, its interconnectedness, global interplay, always going to make it vulnerable. But people routinely put the death toll at Trump's door. They have zero proof that the numbers would have been any different with Biden or anyone else. That said, he was clearly not the man for the moment. His original daily press briefings, where he would ramble and boast about his ratings and speculate in bizarre fashion about possible cures, those were the opposite of what you needed to reassure and galvanise the public at a time of crisis. And it's arguably why he lost the election. Before COVID, the economy was doing well, and there was an excellent chance that enough people would say, well, he talks a bit of nonsense, but the country's thriving, so I suppose I can put up with the noise. And that was part of the problem, of course. In the first few months of the pandemic, you could see that his denial was linked to the shock and the horror of coming to realise what this was going to do to the economy, and hence his re-election. All those early briefings arguing it would all be over by Easter, it wasn't really that big a deal, all of this was powerful wishful thinking. But a good crisis leader thinks of the country, not of their re-election prospects. When they speak, they empathise with the worry and the suffering of the people in the country, not their TV ratings. And he failed that test. His erratic nature didn't prevent a booming economy in good times, but it wasn't what the country needed in a crisis. Now, related to that was his attitude to science. Of course, he didn't want pessimistic epidemiologists talking up the pandemic, but then there was also his approach to climate change. He spent his entire term trying to gut NASA and NOAA's work in studying climate change. The administration tried to axe NASA's carbon monitoring system and the Orbiting Carbon Observatory-3 mission. He appointed climate change critics to key positions who then tried to undermine the production of the State of the Environment report, amongst other things. Now, don't get me wrong. I have no problem with the idea that a president might be sceptical about a prevailing scientific orthodoxy. I think it'd be good if all science that feeds into important public policy areas should have a red team system where leading critics of the orthodoxy get to challenge it and test it in an organised, managed way. But to dismantle programs to actually monitor what's happening on the grounds that you don't want the results to go the wrong way, that is the most ridiculous anti-science position you can take. Argue about what the data mean, but to stop collecting it in the first place, that's not even trying to take a scientifically valid approach. By the way, you'll notice I don't include Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement on climate change as one of my downsides. I've said numerous times on here, international agreements are poor governance mechanisms. Ultimately, progress on climate change comes from countries deciding to take action in beginning a transition to zero carbon energy technologies in a way that makes best sense for them. The Paris Agreement is a badly written pile of compromised garbage that only has value as a symbol of a commitment to progress. Pushing back against it, like pushing back against the Iran nuclear deal or NAFTA, could have the effect of challenging people to sort out their sloppy thinking. In practice, during Trump's term, America's use of coal declined and its carbon emissions therefore did likewise. Now that happened in spite of him, but it happened, and the US emissions declined more than many of the countries that actually signed up to the Paris Agreement. That wouldn't have continued in the same way if he'd won a second term, but people are currently assuming that what Biden is planning to do will be massively more successful. And the jury's out on that. And he signed straight back up to Paris, which is the symbolic bit, but what's he actually going to do? Is it going to be smart policy, or will it destabilise America's energy mix, leading to the sort of problems that have been seen in California, thereby potentially losing mainstream support for action at all? What's worse for the planet? Reducing emissions while challenging ill-defined orthodoxy, or virtue signalling combined with incompetent policy that alienates the population? There's nothing inevitable about that last one. But there seems to be a remarkable lack of curiosity on the left as to which policies actually work. So we'll see. A few final observations. You'll note that 2 impeachments haven't featured on my list. It's one of the things that the partisan Democrats make a big deal out of. The first president to be impeached twice. What a massive failure of his. But that first impeachment was a deeply partisan affair. They've been itching to impeach Trump since the day he was elected. They jumped the first time they thought they had something, which turned out really not to be something. I think in so doing, they degraded the seriousness of impeachment. I wouldn't be surprised if now every single presidency ended up with some sort of impeachment noise around midterm on some grounds or another, all tactical, all flimsy, one of the consequences of this term that didn't really come from Trump. Because really, the fact is that the mainstream media and the Democrats never ever gave Trump a chance, and they all point to how it ended up and say, well, that's why, but they partly created that outcome, it seems to me, by being so relentlessly more prejudiced against the man than they had been against any other president. Second, I've seen nothing in the last 4 years that made me think that Trump was a nice person. And that doesn't really matter. Great leaders don't have to be nice people. Sometimes they're not even good leaders in a different context. The great British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was actually an awful peacetime Prime Minister. He had many qualities that people justifiably disdained, but come the moment, he was the man for the hour. Now, whether Trump is a nice guy or not isn't the issue. There's an argument that his unorthodox approach and his total disregard for a herd of sacred cows threw up some interesting possibilities that others might not have done. Third, some of his supporters put forward the fact that he didn't start any new wars as being a positive. And it may be, but his lack of strategic judgment puts you in a position of vulnerability when it comes to those things. Because the point is, as we found out with World War II, sometimes the determination to avoid a war that needs to be fought is the way to store up worse consequences and bloodshed for the future. But on the other hand, the US had gotten into the bad habit of taking on a conflict and then ending up stuck in places as it failed to plan for the destabilising consequences of its own actions, challenging the idea that forces should be just stuck in situ forever. It's not a bad thing per se. There are times when the sensible thing to do is to stay. The withdrawal from Syria had some immensely negative consequences, for instance. And finally this, being prepared to take action that others advise you will be risky. It can be foolish or it can be genius, only history gets to decide. There's no doubt that the world had become increasingly risk-averse and timid in international relations in recent decades. Trump's willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, to be abrasive in making demands, it didn't have to be done in the coarse and public way that he did it, but there are times when it's highly effective, and we could do with relearning that. We also learned that there's been a growing gulf between the cultural conservative citizens and the elites, which has become a more stark divide than traditional left-wing versus right-wing divides. Again, you don't need to ape Trump's style to decide to represent that constituency. But it's laid open the challenge now for Republicans, and this is a challenge the British Conservatives are also grappling with, over whose voices they're now going to represent. In that sense, Donald Trump hasn't created, but he tapped into and defined the politics of his age. If he'd just been the aberration that the media and the establishment are pretending, there'd be nothing left once the Twitter account had been suspended. But that's not the case. For better or for worse, political realities have been redrawn over the last 4 years. It's a lot less certain what happens next than it has been for a generation. That may be a good thing. I guess we'll soon find out.